Thank you very much, Chair. And you're absolutely right to recall that the first analysis of digestive decontamination was carried out at an SRLF conference in 1993. Michael Wolf was kind enough to lend me some information from a study, the survey that he did very recently with a number of reanimation figures in France. It's not exhaustive, as you can see, but broadly speaking, about 5% only use this STD, and even then only occasionally. The English, for their part, do a lot better than that, with 250 ICUs surveyed. All of them answered, and the use rate was 5% also. So, the answers given for why STD is not used is that for the French, they're not convinced of the usefulness. They feel that there's an increased risk of bacterial resistance and that there can be other ways of going about it than using STD. And the British say the same, which is perhaps a rare occurrence in and of itself to have the British and French saying the same thing. But they, too, do not believe that it really works, nor are they satisfied about the concerns regarding antibiotic resistance. There are also regulatory or administrative concerns. This is a treatment which has not been approved and which is quite cumbersome and complicated to implement. Microbiologists do not very much like this approach. It was looked into in more detail as part of some more recent studies, as you can see here, where we tried to formalize our understanding of what the practitioners, the physicians and other decision makers were thinking. So we did a Delphi study looking at all the psychological domains of prescription, and there are many of them, as you can see here. And again, the idea is that they feel that it can increase resistance, increase Clostridium infection rates. They feel that studies have not adequately answered questions about resistance issues, and then there are all the concerns which have to do with the consensus, with strategy, which come second. So ultimately, whether we're talking about France, the UK, North America, or Australia and New Zealand, everyone is broadly thinking along the same lines and posing the same questions. So that being said, it is somewhat problematic because we've been working on STD for some 35 years now. So does it have proven efficacy? That was the title of this session. In terms of EBM, to answer that question quite clearly, it does. There are dozens of RCTs, practically a dozen meta-analysis projects, all of which conclude broadly that the full STD regimen, including topical, digestive and oropharyngeal disinfection, as well as systemic prophylaxis during the early days, can actually reduce mortality and ICU-acquired LRTI and BSI. So to recall the overall picture, systemic antibiotics to prevent early infection, and topical antibiotics to prevent secondary infections, particularly respiratory ones, and why not with antibiotic-resistant germs. So we can see a drop in mortality to the tune of 25% in relative terms with systemic antibiotics, but not with topical antibiotics. And this is one of the ongoing discussions regarding the relative efficacy merits of the two approaches. And you can see all the different dates here of the studies pointing to these conclusions. We also have the bacteremia approach, which has also shown a very marked reduction with the full regime also. So we only need to treat about 20 patients to avoid one death. It's a very effective approach, and there's a very recent analysis which looked at the measures taken to prevent respiratory infections and showed that only one could prevent this infection and bring about long-term improvements, and that was SDD for the patients. And then you have some trials that have shown that STD reduces mortality, as in the case of this Dutch study. The Dutch flags you'll see now and then show that these are Dutch studies. This was an essay in 2003, a publication in 2003, which showed a very marked drop in mortality, even higher than what you find in meta-analysis. And then you have the major Dutch study under Mark Bunten, a randomized cluster study with a large number of patients, 13 ICUs, standard design in terms of the treatment, and there was a crossover between the different treatment arms, standard, oropharyngeal decontamination alone, or oral digestive decontamination both, and digestive antibiotics. Despite the large number of patients, there were, however, some slight differences between the group, which proved significant given the figures. And the outcomes of the study in terms of gross figures was not positive. There was a slight drop in mortality in trend terms, but in gross terms, it was not positive. When it was adjusted, it did, however, become significantly positive, so that once adjustments had been made for the cluster effects and some of the other differences between the group, there was in fact a significant difference for the criteria involved, so that the study concluded that there was indeed a reduction in mortality with an NNT to avoid one death, which was not too high, and some beneficial effects and duration of mechanical ventilation and so on. And this also reduced the use of systemic antibiotics, but it didn't avoid the topical antibiotics. So we could no doubt conclude with a certain amount of a certain degree of certitude that in the Netherlands, in Dutch ICUs, it reduces mortality, the duration of MV, of hospital-acquired infections, systemic antibiotic use, which is rather encouraging. However, there are still discussions underway about the risks and benefits, respectively, of SOD and STD, and the risks and benefits in the longer term, bearing in mind that the original sin of these Dutch studies is that they were carried out in the Netherlands, where, as you can see, the resistance rates for the various germs that we are concerned with are very low, as we all know. So that returning to the questions of those who might be expected to use this approach, we can see that opinion is divided. Although everyone is, broadly speaking, convinced that there can be a benefit in using STD for the patients to whom it is delivered. However, not everyone is convinced that the benefits outweigh the risks. And on that issue, when it comes to topical antibiotics, people feel that perhaps this is less of a problem. But again, here, the same group in the Netherlands did a group of comparing STD with SOD, which you may have seen in JAMA not so long ago, which concludes that there is an overall equivalence between the two, although there can be somewhat less bacteremia with total DD and systemic antibiotics. And this is an issue which has persisted from the outset. Could it be that it is the direct effect of the systemic antibiotics administered? Now, the British, for their part, looked at what was happening with a very small number of ICUs using STD, only 9 of them, and using the data which are quite reliable of IFNARC. They noted that with the adjustments that had been made, they showed that there was no effect on mortality, but some effect on bacteria. And when you look at Clostridium and MRSA, there are some data to note there. So in the Netherlands, things are clearer than elsewhere where we do not really know where we stand. So despite 35 years of studies, we still need to do more complementary studies. Regarding the question then of whether there is a hazard in terms of higher resistance rates, or whether conversely STD can lower resistance rates, in the Netherlands it would appear from the evidence that there's a tendency for STD to reduce resistance rates. Now, we've noted the context that we're familiar with, but all the resistance markers have dropped in the STD arm. And if we look at the complementary analysis that was carried out of the cluster assay by Desmet and Van Tem, we can see there too, if anything, a drop in resistance. So whether it's MDR, bacteremia, or respiratory colonization germs, and this can be for aminosine, or phosphorine, or indeed for colimycin, which is of great concern, quite naturally. But similarly, when they themselves look in a little bit more detail at what is actually happening in the digestive tract with sequential sampling, there is possibly a trend for changes in colimycin-resistant bacterial colonies. When the germs are tobramycin resistant, they're more difficult to eradicate, although the overall eradication rate remains high. And if you look at the meta-analysis, there's not much change in terms of resistance. If anything, it seems to drop where it does move for aminosine. For colistin, as you can see, the effect there would favor decontamination. Fluoroquinolone, a drop if anything, and phosphorine, if anything, a drop also. So that it is the oxygram plus which would go in the other direction. That sends us back to another somewhat older study which showed that with topical STD, if anything, there can be an increase in GPCs, particularly in MRSA. So that if we look at the differences between the Netherlands and France, we can look at cocci-gram plus resistance to cyclophorin, and such forms of resistance for cephalosporins, in 2012 are less pronounced, although they are still substantial in the Netherlands than they are elsewhere. So, again, from the Netherlands, we have a study of the resistance issues comparing the two approaches, either topical alone or topical and systemic. And what this shows is that, again, resistance does not increase overall, but that there is more of a trend for a little bit of an increase over time for increase in resistance to cephalosporin, although this is not very marked. whereas there's a significant upward trend in the aminosin resistant germs. And this is something which does not emerge in terms of clinical results, but it nevertheless sends us a signal. And this is something which stands out looking at patients who receive STD continually for 2 or 3 weeks, experience a pretty marked increase in aminoside resistance germs. There's perhaps less change for the others, but these could perhaps increase possible resistance to colistin. So that there are very marked variations from one patient to the next, which does not necessarily emerge in clinical terms. But this is something which leads to some persistent concerns as to whether it does or not increase resistance. If anything, it would seem that the answer is positive, but we do not have enough studies that have looked into this issue to have a final answer. And if we look at the longer-term issues, because all of this is rather short-term, although in the meta-analysis it was shown that the long-term risks could be considered as weak or non-existent, all of this is based on short-term studies. Again, we have few long-term studies, and in those long-term studies, what we find, once again, is that if anything, there is a drop in resistance to GNBs, but an emergence of GPCs, particularly enterococci. For those who have MRSA or VRE, that could potentially be a problem. And again, the Dutch looked over a 4-year period at what was happening in those units which did or did not use decontamination. And this showed, once again, that in the Netherlands, if anything, there was a tendency towards a drop in resistance for Cepro and also tobramycin, where there wasn't really much of a change, and colimycin it was, if anything, declining in terms of resistance. And those who introduced digestive decontamination, on average, observed a drop in resistance rates. So it does seem to work overall in the Netherlands. Despite this, the editorial which went along with the meta-analysis said that despite all of this, the question remains open in the long run, so that we